with Sam Seder.
The destiny of America is always safer in the hands of the people than in the conference rooms of any elite.
Sam Seder.
They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
The Majority Report with Sam Seder.
Ever get the feeling you've been cheated?
It is Tuesday, March 21, 2023. My name is Sam Seder. This is the 5-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. On the program today, Spencer Ackerman, columnist for The Nation magazine, author of the Forever Wars newsletter on Ghost, and author of his most recent Reign of Terror, how the 9/11 era destabilized America and produced Trump. Also on the program today, a jittery nation looks to downtown Manhattan as barricades erected around a courthouse awaiting a potential Trump indictment. The IPCC report says we have less than 10 years to slow catastrophic warming. New lawsuit from a Fox producer may create a grab bag run on Fox News' personal, or I should say corporate bank account. LA school workers launch a 3-day strike, the second biggest school system in the country. Joe Biden signs a law to block D.C. City Council's ability to reform D.C. carceral laws. Federal judge blocks California from requiring safety features for new semi-automatic guns. The Israeli government says they'll move ahead with their plans to undermine its judicial system. Macron government barely survives a no-confidence vote. In the wake of his attempts to raise the retirement age, Biden signs a COVID origin info declassification and vetoes a Republican attempt to bar investment managers from socially responsible investing. All this and more on today's Majority Report. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for joining us. Emma is out today. A couple of things, house cleaning. I should tell you right now that on Thursday, a day when Emma usually is what driving the ship, steering
hosting,
the ship?
I think,
or hosting. Yeah, hosting. You could also say
at the helm.
At the helm. Thank you, Bradley. I am going to go down to Florida for a couple hours, literally, and do the Patrick Bet David show, which is on Valuetainment. He is an entrepreneur, and he has a show sort of, not too dissimilar from ours, I guess. I haven't seen too much of it, but I'm going down there for, I think the entire trip is less than 24 hours. So I will not get a tan. I probably won't even see the sun. But I'll be on that. And then I think we'll probably run it, later, or show some clips, or, stuff like that. So, and he sort of seems to lean a little bit to the right, as far as I can tell. So that could be interesting. I don't know. We'll find out. But, so that's happening. And, one more day of, I guess, celebrating the 20-year anniversary of our illegal invasion and occupation of Iraq. I am saying celebrate, obviously, somewhat tongue-in-cheek. Just pre-recorded an interview with Spencer Ackerman literally moments ago. He's got a great perspective on these things, and really important that we recognize the disaster that Iraq was, how we got into it, and what we need to do if we don't want to follow down that path again. Here is former National Security Advisor John Bolton, who at the time, and I'm not quite sure exactly when this was, that he was recess appointed to be the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations during the Bush years. He was considered to be so outside the mainstream that a Republican-controlled Senate would not confirm him. And he had to get a recess appointment by George W. Bush. He was an OG neocon, very much part of the broader sort of like cabal, I guess you could say, that was promoting the Iraq War and the reasons to go into Iraq. And in addition to piece by Spencer Ackerman, I read a piece by I think it was Matthew Schwartz, Matthias Schwartz, Matt Schwartz in Business Insider, where two CIA agents were interviewed, and they made the point that what the Bush administration was doing in the run-up to the Iraq War, they were not looking for justification or for reasons to invade Iraq. That's not what they were looking for from the CIA. What they were looking for were promotional points, were talking points in which to sell this idea to the American public. And part of that sales job has been the sort of retroactive claiming and moving of the goalposts and claiming and essentially changing the reasons why we went into Iraq, because they were all built on a lie. And the Iraq War, by any estimation, a disaster, except for the oil companies that have leases. And I guess from Iran's perspective, but they didn't want, they weren't the ones who invaded Iraq this time around. Iran was definitely empowered by what we did to Iraqi society. Here is John Bolton on Time Radio's John Pinar, is that his name? Here's a clip from there.
I do the same thing because knowing what I know now, I wouldn't have made some of the mistakes that were made after the war, disbanding the Iraqi army, setting up the Coalition Provisional Authority. Look, the decision to overthrow Saddam Hussein was made not simply on the basis of the threat he posed in 2003, but the inevitable threat he would have posed once free of UN sanctions, once free of UN weapons inspectors. Saddam
okay,
Hussein,
so I mean, this is important because none of what he's saying, incidentally, was sold as the justification for the war. There was an imminent threat, we were told, to the United States by Saddam Hussein. And all these things that you're saying about that, you know, we failed in the post-war, the part of the endeavor of the Iraq War was this opportunity to create a year zero type of situation where, you know, they could have a petri dish of like Milton Friedman's fantasy of a completely privatized Garden of Eden, if you will. And this idea now, I mean, you could see just even in that brief clip where Bolton is moving the goalpost. Well, even if Saddam Hussein was not a threat to us then, we were preempting his ability to be a threat in the future. Contemplate that for a moment. First off, there's no reason to believe that he would have been any more of a threat in the future than he was at that moment. But the idea that we're going to go in and kill hundreds of thousands of Iraqi civilians, and again, hundreds of thousands to a million, it depends on whose numbers you want to use, but there is no contesting. It is not controversial that we killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. We displaced millions of people, created millions of refugees, destabilized the region because of a futuristic threat. Keep running.
the basis of the threat he posed in 2003, but the inevitable threat he would have posed once free of UN sanctions, once free of UN weapons inspectors. Saddam Hussein is dead, and Iraq is not pursuing nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons. For people who say, well, the Middle East became more unstable, the Middle East became more unstable for lots of reasons, and an Iraq armed with nuclear weapons would have been far more unstable than what we see today. The biggest mistake made by the United States, and we made a number, there's no doubt about it. The biggest mistake, however, was Barack Obama's decision in 2011 to withdraw American forces, which did provide a bit of a ballast for the country of Iraq. And we found within 3 years, given the rise of ISIS, unpredicted by anybody, we had to go back in. All of this is counterfactual hypothesizing, but I believe had we stayed in Iraq, the situation would be much better. The second biggest mistake.
Pause it. I mean, this is just, I mean, this is, first of all, there is absolutely zero reason to believe that Iraq would have nuclear capability today. Zero reason. They found nothing when the weapons inspectors were there. Nothing. No program, nothing. The idea that the problem with Iraq was 12 years after he claims we won the war, Barack Obama pulled out the majority of troops. How many decades were we supposed to occupy this country in this successful war? Continue.
All of this is counterfactual hypothesizing, but I believe had we stayed in Iraq, the situation would be much better. The second biggest mistake was not taking advantage of having a substantial American military position simultaneously in Afghanistan to Iran's east and Iraq to Iran's west to help the dissidents, help the opposition in Iran, and allow them to remove the Ayatollahs from power.
I mean, history records that there were no weapons of mass destruction found in Iraq, which was one of the main arguments for the invasion in the first place. Tell me, if you could do it again, knowing what you know now, what would you do differently?
I'd do the same thing, because knowing what I know now, I wouldn't have made some of the mistakes.
It's just a repeat of the beginning thing.
There you go. So basically, his one lament is
we didn't use it to
two laments. He's got two laments. One is that we haven't permanently occupied that country. And two is that we didn't use that permanent occupation as a springboard to invade Iran.
Glad everyone's being reflective.
Unbelievable. Stick around for Spencer Ackerman as he dismantles a lot of what you just heard and more. And the importance of revisiting this. It's going to happen again. It's just a question of when. And it's going to happen again because there's been no reckoning with every time it's happened in the past. None. Couple of words from our sponsors today. I realized that I'm going to be using, all right, I want to be circumspect here, but I am part of a business endeavor that is largely unrelated from the Majority Report. It's like a little hobby that I had no, we'll talk about it soon. But the amazing thing is that I'm going to be using both of our, two of our sponsors today. First, Shopify. Shopify is a commerce platform. It has revolutionized millions of businesses worldwide. Doesn't matter whether you're selling, I don't know, tchotchkes or DVDs or merch or seeds. Doesn't matter what you're selling. Shopify is the way to do it. It simplifies online selling and it simplifies in person. So you can do both simultaneously and focus, of course, on growing your business. Shopify covers every sales channel, provides an in-person POS system, payment system, to an all-in-one e-commerce platform. It lets you sell across all the social media platforms, like the TikTok marketplace, the Facebook marketplace, the Instagram marketplace. I imagine Twitter will have a marketplace soon. You know, Shopify will be there if they do that. It is packed with industry-leading tools ready to ignite your growth. Shopify gives you complete control of your business and your brand. And you don't, this is the best part. You know it's true, or I wouldn't be able to do it. You don't have to learn any new skills or design code. Thanks to 24/7 help and extensive business course library, Shopify is there to support your success in every step of the way. Now it's your turn to get serious about selling and try Shopify today. This is Possibility, powered by Shopify. You can sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/majority. All lowercase. Shopify.com/majority. $1 per month trial period. Go to shopify.com/majority. Take your business to the next level today. Shopify.com/majority. And another sponsor today will also power this business. I've used stamps.com in the past, back in the days where we would send out DVDs as a membership enticement. Back in the early days, I would have Mila stick them in a bag. She was like, she must have been 8. And I would pay her, Arkansas child labor laws wages. And she would put them in a bag. And all my postage was via stamps.com. It is time for you to get ahead of the competition by using stamps.com to mail and ship. Stamp.com lets you print your own postage and shipping labels right from your home or office. Stamps.com has postage rates that you literally cannot find anywhere else. Up to 84% off a U.S. Postal Service and UPS. For 25 years, Stamps.com has been indispensable for over 1 million businesses. And if you sell products online, Stamps.com seamlessly connects with every major marketplace and shopping cart. I'm going to be using it soon. Knock on wood. Stamps.com to print postage wherever you do business. I know people are very excited about what this business is going to be. That's going to be exciting. And the beauty about stamps.com, all you need, computer and a printer. They even send you a free scale. This is super easy. Set up your business for success when you get started with stamps.com today. Sign up with promo code Majority Report for a special offer that includes a 4-week trial plus free postage and a free digital scale. There are no long-term commitments or contracts. Just go to stamps.com, click the microphone at the top of the page, enter code Majority Report, all one word. Stamps.com, click the microphone at the top of the page, enter the code Majority Report. We'll, of course, put the links in the podcast and YouTube description. And lastly, what protects me in all my online endeavors? What keeps my ID safe? What keeps my kids from spending too much time watching one of the most ridiculous YouTube shows I've ever seen in my life instead of doing their homework on their computer? Aura. Aura is an easy-to-use app that includes everything you need to stay safe online. Aura protects you from scammers and hackers. It scans the so-called dark web, sees if your email or your passwords, or really importantly, your social security number is up for sale. Someone found it and is selling it to somebody who's going to exploit it. And if it finds it, it alerts you fast. They help you fight back against those websites that make your your personal information public by automatically requesting removal of your info. This helps with robocalls, operational security. And you got to keep doing it automatically, and that's what Aura does. Aura also gives you near real-time alerts on suspicious credit inquiries. So if someone's trying to open a loan or a credit card in your name, Aura lets you know fast. I had this when I opened up a bank account for Mila. I, of course, knew it was me, but it was just incredibly reassuring to realize that, that nobody can get away with, building up a credit card bill in my name. Their VPN allows you to stay anonymous online by keeping your browsing history and your personal information safe and encrypted. They protect your devices from viruses, malware, spyware. Bad guys can't break in. And like I said, they also allow you to restrict what the kids can do with their devices. You can restrict specific apps. You can put on screen time limits. You can put on focus time so that they're not using YouTube and they're actually doing their coding or whatever they claim to be doing with their YouTube in the background, supposedly. I'm not pointing any fingers, Saul. Their password manager lets you store and access your online passwords securely and conveniently. And the beauty of this is all in one. This is a one-stop shop. You don't have to get 7 different apps to do all these functions. You just need one. Aura, aura.com/majority, AURA.com/majority. You are going to be shocked at how much of your private information Aura finds exposed over those 2 weeks. You can go get a 2-week free trial at aura.com/majority. Of course, link in the podcast and YouTube descriptions and at majority.fm. All right, we're going to take a quick break. We're going to come back. Spencer Ackerman, columnist for The Nation, author of the Forever Wars newsletter on Ghost, and author of his latest Reign of Terror, How the 9/11 Era Destabilized America and Produced Trump. Quick break, right back. We are back. Sam Seder on the Majority Report. Joining us now, Spencer Ackerman, columnist for The Nation, author of the Forever Wars newsletter on Ghost. You should check out. You can, after you read Spencer's, come over and see the AM Quickie. Spencer, you and I have probably been talking about this subject on radio or whatever we're talking on now for at least 15 years. I don't know if it was 2004 or 2005, the first time that we spoke, but it would have been around that time. And when I revisit it, and I know you go through this, it becomes incredibly depressing and frustrating in some respects. Here we are on the 20th anniversary, and you're writing about how we've learned really no lessons yet. What are the biggest lessons you think that we haven't learned yet?
Okay, where to begin? Yes, I am forever just going to be Walter Sobchak from The Big Lebowski. The Iraq War is just, and the War on Terror more broadly, is just going to be where I live. That's not fun, but it's required. Only Americans could convince themselves that 20 years is a substantial amount of time. This is an eye blink. There are U.S. troops in Iraq while we speak. This is not ancient history. This is living history. This is affecting the Middle East to this day. This isn't going to change because America, and I'm getting your question, doesn't want to learn very fundamental lessons. Fundamental lesson number 1, American imperialism is bad. It's bad primarily for the people who come under its gaze, who have their wealth extracted, who have their lives destroyed, who are turned into refugees. America needs, frankly, a different socioeconomic model in order to change. We're just going to keep doing resource wars, frankly, under capitalism. That's really, really well established. So number 1, if you don't want to do Iraqs anymore, let's change the fundamental economy of the United States.
All right, let's start with number 1.
All right.
Okay, let's start with number 1, and then we will get to number 2, because one of the things that it occurred to me by 2005, 2006. The American public had, maybe it was even 2004, the American public had no seemingly awareness or deep awareness that we were engaged in a war. It seems to me that there was no sense that we were at war. There was people are just going about their lives, no context. And I'm talking during it. There was no sense that we were in any way like waging a war where hundreds of thousands of people were killed.
Yeah, that was the system working the way it's supposed to work. That ultimately, one of the inevitable consequences of the 1973 creation of the all-volunteer military at the tail end of the Vietnam War, supposedly incorporating a lesson of the Vietnam War, is that all of society no longer goes to war. Increasingly, we're dependent on a professional military class to do this, and that inevitably is going to create a significant social fracture within a country. I heard this so many times, not primarily from civilians, but primarily from the military, that America was not at war. The Army and the Marine Corps was at war. And you remember shortly after 9/11, George W. Bush telling people that, yes, there's this now endless crusade to preserve freedom and so on and so forth, but you should go shopping. Like, things are going to be normal for you. The tax burden on the wealthy is going to come down, which ultimately means the burden is going to be more acutely felt by the working and what'll remain of the middle classes. And that's going to be it. And we should recognize, I think, that once we sort of funnel ourselves into this mode where America decides that it has the right and responsibility to police the world, that the mechanism that is going to do that is going to be one that most of the country is not going to be impacted by and not going to have a burden of supporting beyond a kind of awkward thank you for your service distance. And it is not surprising that many veterans who chose to do that often didn't super choose in the way that we understand the word choosing, because there is such a thing that the veterans talk about called the poverty draft, which is that the military is a pathway to the middle class, while so many pathways to the middle class are failing and not becoming available. And you can hear to this day a justifiable anger and bitterness that the rest of the country wasn't really with them, that certainly didn't understand what they were doing. But that is a structural, you can't even call it defect, because it's not a bug, it's a feature.
Right. And I mean, that's what I think is also that feature not only like sort of inhibits the reaction in real time, but it also makes it that much harder to learn that lesson, because we can't get to lesson number 2 Unlearned without sort of like lesson 1 seeing the actual costs of this. And we have no reports back from Iraq these days. We haven't had it in years and years and years. I don't know if we ever really had it outside of like a couple of independent journalists who weren't embedded with U.S. forces, to get a sense of just like how much devastation, how much we immiserated this country. We didn't even know during the Clinton embargo years, and so we had no sense of what was going on there at the time. Before we get to 2, because I think we need to also get like what the agenda was for some of these players. Let's go back and talk about the run up to the war, because I had mentioned to you that and one of the things I had never heard, because I will cop to not having read Alan Greenspan's biography, was that he conceded it was largely about oil, which I'm sure you remember, though, at the time when anybody in the run up to the Iraq war said this is about oil, they were essentially, treated like lepers. And laughed out of the room by across the full spectrum of pontificators. But let's talk about that run up a little bit, because at the time it seemed like it seemed like it was going so fast, but this was over the course of a year and a half, essentially, just slowly, methodically pushing these points. What part of that sticks out to you? Like, I'm reading this interview in Business Insider by Matt Schwartz about the two CIA agents who, basically said, we need to call George W. Bush a liar because he was a liar. He lied about the knowledge that they supposedly had, the surety that they had. Does anything resonate? I mean, I know you were I think you were in college at that time, maybe, but what resonates for you from that period?
Primarily that the people in charge of the country, the Bush administration, its Republican and media enablers, its Democratic cowed enablers, viewed 9/11 as an opportunity, not as a disaster that ought to occasion a very serious inquiry into how U.S. foreign policy had blown back on itself, but an opportunity to reassert those violent extract foreign policy as a response to 9/11. The more you drill down on the Iraq War, the more you kind of get, this sense of well-trodden paths to inevitability that at the time, people, particularly in the Clinton administration and its allies, viewed as obstacles to an invasion, while ultimately creating this kind of path dependency that once a true shock to the system like 9/11 happened, made it extremely convivial to invading. Like, for instance, not only bombing Iraq throughout the 1990s, not only the economic sanctions on Iraq, but at a time of U.S., kind of being, at the time of the United States being the last superpower standing, viewing Saddam Hussein as this unacceptable holdout against American power in the Middle East, which becomes a focal point. So in 1998, the Clinton administration, it's the height of impeachment, agrees to this neoconservative-backed measure in the Senate called the Iraq Liberation Act. The Clinton people view that as a way of kind of having their cake and eating it too, forestalling a larger war on Iraq, but still making regime change, the overthrow of Saddam Hussein, the official policy of the United States. And after 9/11, this allows a lot of people in the Bush administration to, on the one hand, cynically, but on the other hand, they have a bit of a point, say that why would you object to ultimately overthrowing Saddam Hussein? You ultimately agreed that that ought to be the goal of U.S. foreign policy, and it has a democratic legacy as well as a republic, as well as being a Republican ambition. Why not just do it? The security state goes along with that. People, shout to Matt; he's a great reporter. The CIA, I think, is not really in a position to evade blame for the Iraq War. It is multiple things are true at once. Multiple layers exist on top of one another. Bush-wide, undoubtedly, the CIA went along with it. In certain circumstances, the same sort of dynamic as with the the Clinton administration applies with the CIA. That efforts they took that they may have conceived of as inhibiting a war, in fact, makes it more likely and ultimately manifest. To give just one example, the Cheney faction within the Bush administration, Vice President Dick Cheney, his aides, Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, his aides in the Policy Bureau headed by Doug Feith, they push very aggressively to get the CIA to agree that there is an operational tie between Saddam Hussein and al-Qaeda. This is a complete fantasy. The Iraq War will ultimately make an al-Qaeda presence in Iraq a very virulent reality, and that ultimately becomes ISIS, but we're getting ahead of ourselves.
Right.
And so the CIA, as a way of trying to bureaucratically get out from under this pressure, caves to it and creates a document under a senior intelligence analyst named Jamie Mishik called Al-Qaeda and Iraq, Assessing a Murky Relationship, which has all of the information that the Cheneyite-Rumsfeld faction would want ultimately to be able to marshal, to say such a connection exists, and then say, but we don't really see a lot of these ties. We think a lot of this is kind of, thin, not really substantiated, and so forth. And then the Cheneyites say, thank you for your service. We appreciate you giving us everything we need, and we're going to run with that. And so that's how it went. The CIA was not an obstacle to this at all. And to have the CIA say that its sophisticated analysis was ignored and manipulated by the Bush administration is, fair point. Not exactly wrong, but an evasion of their own responsibility. And ever since, the U.S. intelligence agencies have said it is unfair and mean to point this out when they have other assessments that you want to believe, which is a lot like if I cheat on my spouse, they tend not to trust me in the future. And then I get angry and say, oh, that's unfair. That was that one time in the past. Well, no, that's how violations of trust operate.
And to be clear, what you're describing in terms of this of these reports, and particularly that report that was generated, but broadly speaking, they have a 10-page report. It's 9 pages of different possible, sightings of Muhammad Atta in Prague, and Saddam Hussein clearly knows Al Qaeda is in Iraq. And then on page
in the
10,
parts of Iraq he doesn't control.
Right. And in page 10, it says, now, a lot of this is very dubious. And also, Hussein is like watching Al Qaeda because he has a very contentious relationship with them in the same way that, like, the United States, Atlanta knows that there are Cop City protesters, that type of thing. And they're covering their asses by that page 10. But they also know they're giving the Bush administration what they want at that point. So there's sort of they're getting their cake and eating it too. And we know that if the CIA wants to have a narrative destroyed in the public, they have mechanisms in which to do that, right? I mean, it's not
for instance, creating 2 euphemisms that will be very familiar throughout the war on terrorism. One, enhanced interrogation, which is to say, when we torture, it's not really torture. And one of my personal favorites from the Obama era, targeted killings.
Right.
When we assassinate people with drones without even knowing necessarily who they are. So the CIA gets its narrative across very often.
Right. So they have the ability to deal with that. And they just decided.
Let me also just say, in fairness to the CIA, and I know that's always a fraught thing to say, but to zoom out a second, it's important to look at the structural dynamic that the Bush administration pursued after 9/11, which is to say, holy shit, there's a giant fucking smoking crater in lower Manhattan and at the Pentagon. And we were in power when this happened. The intelligence agencies are at fault. Republicans in Congress immediately ran with that because it was convenient. Democrats who, even if they were inclined to challenge that narrative, which they were not, the press not also inclined to challenge that narrative. You heard Republican talking points around then that said, well, Bush was in power for 8 months. Clinton was in power for 8 years. Whose fault is this? Let's investigate. The Democratic Party was like, all right, we don't want any of that smoke. That's fine. The intelligence agencies can take the blame for that. Being put in a position of institutional responsibility for a catastrophe like 9/11 is a bureaucratically perilous position for the intelligence agencies to be in. To get out from under that danger, the Bush administration made very clear that the intelligence agencies, as demonstrated by Cheney's constant presence at CIA headquarters, was going to have to go along with some stuff.
Right, which is, we want that raw intelligence. I don't care what it says, what the caveats are. We just want the words operational ties. And
they said in conservative media all throughout the run-up to the war and then after, when it was time to affix blame for how badly the occupation is going, a forerunner of the way the Trump people who want to wield a deep state of their own blame and discredit the one that actually exists, which just so happens to be extremely, extremely, liable for a lot of what exists, and say that it's CIA and State Department appeasement of Saddam Hussein, stretching back through a long period of appeasement of the Arab world in general, that forms an impediment to the valorous war on terror, when in fact the war on terror is being waged in its surveillance, in its torture, in its detention elements by the intelligence agencies themselves.
All right, I want to get
the compounding morass of blame.
Yes. And I want to get to the incentive structure, which brings us to like the lesson number 2 in just a moment. But where was all of these sort of systems failed, right? And theoretically, like let's talk about the media, because the media, if there's going to be any check or accountability for these various sort of structures that failed to do the right thing, we'll get to the incentive structure, which incentivizes the wrong thing to do. But where is like sort of popular opinion, as it were, like it's almost as if the American public is just sort of, they're watching this tennis match on some level, and they're just like as if they have no agency in this story whatsoever. And from my perspective, it seems like it's the media, the media failure there, right? Like, I mean, because that's the only opportunity for there to be any type of accountability for these players who have a different incentive structure. Theoretically, the media has another incentive structure, but it just sort of seemed to have vanished.
So I had forgotten this until someone tweeted it the other day. There was this guy your viewers, I'm sure, probably don't remember, especially if they're younger than we are, named Scott McClellan. He was one of George W. Bush's press secretaries.
Yep.
He leaves around, I want to say 2005, 6, I may be forgetting, and then he writes a memoir. And it's really an interesting document because it's less blame evading and victim creating than your typical like Beltway memoir, Democrat or Republican, general or senior intelligence official, and so on. And this one just sort of marvels from the perspective of White House press secretary at like how little pushback they received throughout the entire prospect, that how they didn't really have to manipulate the media, that it was just pushing on an open door, that the press had gone along with this jingoistic narrative. And like McClellan had this, he just like couldn't conceive of it. And the reason why he couldn't conceive of it is because he hasn't read, Chomsky and Herman, and he doesn't understand the political economy of the media, and is, typically, eager to say like that darn liberal media. And here he was saying, like, I can't believe the liberal media didn't liberal enough, when in fact it was demonstrating really long-standing historical patterns of liberalism, which is going along with these kinds of fiascos instead of, in fact, challenging. And
that's fascinating. All I can think of is Jeff Gannon Guckert when I hear McClellan. Yeah. I don't. Your
viewers are not going to remember that. These are deep cuts.
Deep cuts. We'll maybe someday we'll go down the Jeff Gannon Guckert wormhole. But so the press just completely drops the ball. Like, why do you think that was?
They bought into the war on terror. They were terrified of being outside the very limited and deliberately cultivated band of acceptable opinion, which they at the same time on their opinion sides policed. You'll remember that Phil Donahue was like the only anti-war and like very gingerly anti-war.
Yes.
TV host on cable news. He got canned. There was money to be made in the war on terror. There was a spectacle, and there was also a feel-good narrative. And those things are more profitable than ultimately the kind of reporting that you saw from organizations like Knight Ridder that did real national security reporting, that found people in the bowels of the national security state that knew that this was a manufactured crisis and reported it accordingly. And then when they reported it, the major news organizations did not follow that lead and instead doubled down on finding through carefully, presented administration leaks, validation of what the narrative was. Like, for instance, the famous New York Times story about how, Saddam Hussein had, gotten these shipments of aluminum tubes. And even though this is not true, only, that could only be destined for a nuclear weapons program and so forth. And that was credulously presented to the American people as fact. And accordingly, every layer you could see of supposed check on power that we are led from the time, we get our first taste of civics in school to believe holds back this sort of ruthless and blatant aggression, not just internationally, but domestically, fails. All of it.
As you say that dynamic with the press, I think the last time we spoke was about your book, Reign of Terror, and how this era that we're talking about destabilized America and in many respects brought us to the point that we're at now with Trump, which on some level, when you say it makes, obvious, like, of course, something that happened 15, 20 years ago would impact where we are today. But the American psyche, as you started off by saying, this interview is such that, like, those are just two different eras and no relationship whatsoever. I always come back to Gore Vidal's. I remember at one point Gore Vidal came on the show back in the Air America days and, was talking about the United States of Amnesia. And I couldn't really wrap my head around what he was talking about until, I see Michelle Obama hugging George Bush and just sort of like this, the canonization of him. But do you think that dynamic of the media, because I remember Knight Ridder doing this. I remember in the run up to the war, freaking out, and Janine was going on Fox to try and argue against it because she was the only person allowed to go on TV at that time and argue against the war. And, reading The Project for a New American Century and reading Knight Ridder and seeing all of this information, but on page 16 of the newspaper, while the first 15 pages are with the sort of Atta may have been in Prague. And I wonder if that dynamic, also set the table for stuff like the CDC is saying coronavirus is bad, but this website says it's a plandemic by Bill Gates. We've seen this movie before. Maybe we should just believe that it's a plandemic. I mean, I wonder how much that dynamic where the media was completely kowtowed and missed the story of Iraq for all intents and purposes, sort of softened the ground, as it were, for this complete lack of faith in the media reporting during a pandemic.
And I think what we in the media have not really come to terms with as we look at all this stuff, we're like, oh my God, how could these people believe it? Is that we deserve it. We deserve that lack of faith. We deserve that, immediate, overwhelming, not just skepticism. I think skepticism is a different phenomenon than what we're talking about here, but that hostility. Now, do I believe that there is not also good and reality-based and thorough journalism? Of course not. There is all over if you're willing to look for it. But that ain't going to be what's, put on the airwaves in this sort of jingoistic way that we got used to throughout the war on terror. And it hasn't ended. The legacy of this doesn't go away just because it became such an awful, fiasco. History doesn't reset every time the United States elects a president, particularly of a different party. That's just not how any of this works. And there also wasn't, one of the things that, you saw so much. And here's where I would want to push back a little on what you were kind of saying throughout the last, couple questions about like the mindset of the American people. Tens of millions of people worldwide knew this was nonsense and demonstrated against it.
Without a doubt.
And that meant absolutely nothing to their elected officials. It was denigrated. It was treated as mob rule, irresponsibility, objectively pro-Saddam was something you heard a lot from elite media. There was, I could really go on with that, but the point is that this was a manufactured crisis, and lots of people saw through it, and that will inevitably have an effect, a profound effect, on the way many people, both those who went along with the war and those who opposed the war, people who simply, committed the, very understandable decision to believe what their leaders were telling them at a time of enormous post 9/11 public fear.
Right.
Ultimately, that was a betrayed trust. And I don't think we should blame the people for that. I think we should blame the people who both perpetrated that breach of faith and those who enabled it. And those structural imbalances persist today, and their legacies persist.
I accept that that correction. I mean, I think to a certain extent too, though. I remember the sort of real intense violence towards or threat of violence towards people who were vocal in opposing the war. I mean, it was the hostility level was super intense. These people were very, very emboldened.
And this is one of the ways you can see a bit of the I don't want to call it a beta test, but a bit of a precursor condition to the kind of environment you would see, really regnant on the right now in the age of MAGA, however much MAGA insists upon disavowing any relationship it had with the architects of the Iraq War. The war on terror, and certainly at the time of the war in Iraq, the invasion of Iraq, was an opportunity to sort real Americans, those who went along with this, from conditional Americans, those who did not go along with it or are from the wrong, race, religion, socioeconomic background, and so forth. That is how manufactured hysteria has always worked. It works in this case. It works extremely well. It has a very powerful heritage from the Cold War, and we can't pretend like the war on terror is the first time this ever happened. The reason why it's so familiar in this respect, the reason why we can trace these lineages is because of how American and how familiar it is, because of the way this is how the United States, you can really, you can make arguments about this being the case going back to 1619. You can make a case about this going back to, the Mexican-American War, which is, sold entirely on a lie and is how we got most of the Western states. You can go back to Vietnam. You can certainly go to the Cold War period, where you get an easy justification for saying who is truly American and who is not by who stands with this crusade of the elites that preserves, call it what you want, capitalist dominance, white supremacist capitalist dominance, and so on.
All right, well, let's get to that capitalist dominance, because the lesson that the number 2 lesson that you suggest that we have not learned and need to learn is that this type of imperialism, these type of endeavors, are intrinsically tied to what I think is the incentive structure of capitalism. And on some level, we're seeing it play out with China. I don't know. I mean, hopefully we don't get into some type of armed conflict with them. But this is so much of what we're talking about with China. I'm quite convinced that the securing of the oil, and you write in your piece of the oil contracts that these international and American oil companies have. In my mind, it was always about controlling the spigot. Like, you want your buddy to have control of the keg at the party so that you can get your beer early. And we just wanted to make sure that China did not control the keg to fuel their economy, literally, in my estimation. And we're taking the next steps in that pursuit. But talk about the inextricable link between capitalism and imperialism in this sense.
So I would encourage everyone, watching this, to read Naomi Klein's book, The Shock Doctrine, if they haven't. I'm not going to be able to put it more eloquently than that. She pointed out really clearly how there was a sense in which the occupation of Iraq was not a disaster, that it was, in fact, a way to control Iraq's resources, including its state resources. This is one of the, we heard so much throughout the war. I'm as guilty of this as anyone in terms of my early, coverage of the Iraq War. So much about like these central mistakes that the early occupation authority, which was known as the Coalition Provisional Authority, makes at the beginning of the occupation. Its famous early orders to ban the Ba'ath Party, which had been a prerequisite for getting state jobs in Iraq, and also to disband the Iraqi military, which incentivized lots of people to just take their weapons, go home and fight the Americans. All of those things are genuinely and justifiably pointed out as like early and really central mistakes. But we don't talk enough about a CPA order. I think it's either 38 or 39. I forget off the top of my head. From September of 2003, which is a thoroughgoing privatization of an Iraqi governmental infrastructure that had previously been in state hands. I am not saying that those state hands were democratic hands.
Right.
It absolutely was not. That was Saddam Hussein's state apparatus. But the fact of the matter was there was a different economic model going on in Iraq that Iraqis had become extremely accustomed to, and that had portioned out real wealth from Iraq to, again, not democratically, not fairly, not equally, but on a far more widely distributed basis than ultimately would happen when the United States forces privatization on Iraqi state resources. In 2008, when the surge was winding down and it looked like the Iraqi client government had been put on a more stable footing, the State Department prevailed upon the Iraqi government at the time to allow massive concessions to 5 Western oil companies. One of them was French, for good measure. The French were against the war, but now it's time to let bygones to be bygones when the trough was there. And oil development was at that point in Western hands. When Trump says, it was a dumb war, we should have taken the oil, we took a lot of the oil. Like, did the United States, did the people of the United States enjoy that wealth? No, but the corporations, the hydrocarbon corporations, sure did. And that, under Klein's analysis, which I think is quite compelling, demonstrates a lot of how the kind of nitty gritty of the Iraq War actually occurred. All throughout, this was considered impolite to the point of calumny, to pointing out that the Iraq War had real economic winners and losers, and who those winners and losers were. And that helps understand not just how empire works in an age of neoliberalism, but also how American foreign policy works to conceal the economic bases that it operates from, and in its interest, it performs its actions.
Spencer Ackerman, columnist for The Nation, author of Forever Wars newsletter on Ghost. Also, folks should really, if they really want to understand this, in addition to shock doctrine, they should read your book, Reign of Terror, because it really, it's just such a important lesson that, you know, these things, history is not a series of snapshots. Can
I just say one last thing in conclusion? I'm very grateful to you, Sam. Please. I'm sure we are going to be talking about this, you know, on the 40th anniversary of the invasion as well.
I was just thinking that.
Yeah. If there was no accountability for any of this, so we should never expect it to change. We will have to change it. We don't have to live in this world that they have made. We may inherit it, but we don't have to operate according to its logic. And if we organize, we have a chance of actually defeating it. I would also just say, as a bit of a conclusion, that, you know, you mentioned this coalescing Cold War with China. That has a real material component as well. It is a mineral component. It is a rare earth element component. It is also a manufactured resource component like semiconductors. And instead you are, you know, instead of recognizing that, you are getting a lot of Iraq-like BS about how this will be, you know, a challenge between authoritarianism and democracy.
Right.
As if the United States is A, truly democratic, and B, its allies in this endeavor will be fully democratic as well. That's never been the case in any Cold War. It won't be with this one.
Spencer Ackerman, thanks so much for your time, man. We'll put links to all of both your column and the Ghost newsletter and the book. Thanks again.
Thank you, Sam.
Again, make sure you check out Spencer's not Substack, Ghost, and newsletter, and his book. You will not be disappointed. We're going to take a quick break, head into the fun half of the program. We will take your phone calls, 646-257-3920. Folks, just a reminder, it is your support that makes this show possible. You can become a member at jointhemajorityreport.com. When you do, you not only help this show survive and thrive, you also get the free half, free of commercials, and you get the fun half. And you can pick up the app and IM us if you're a member via the app at majorityapp.com. That's jointhemajorityreport.com, jointhemajorityreport.com. Don't forget justcoffee.coop, fair trade coffee, tea, or chocolate. Use the coupon code majority, get 10% off. Emma, well, last night was ESPN, right? What is today? Tuesday?
It's Tuesday, yeah.
Oh my God.
That's
I
right.
can't even figure out what day it is. What happened, Bradley?
We just did a little bit of a March Madness recap, just the last 4 days of NCAA tournament action, and then just touched a little bit on some more NFL free agency updates, and then talked about Andrew Wiggins' absence from the Golden State Warriors. And that's mostly what we got into. YouTube.com/ESPN show for more there.
All right, folks, you can check that out if you like sports. And if you don't like sports, but you know somebody who does like sports, send them over there on Mondays and Thursdays. Matt Leck Media. What's happening in the Matt Leck Media?
Yeah, tonight on The Left Reckoning, Danny Bessner is going to join us, talk about fascism and the Iraq War a little bit. And we're also going to be talking about Minnesota going at public lunch or school lunch debt, and talk about Ted Lasso showing up at the White House a little bit, probably in the postgame. So patreon.com/Left Reckoning.
Why? What happened with Ted Lasso going to the White House?
It came on and said, they got a new season out now, so mental health is really important, and everyone should, not feel ashamed to get mental health. I mean, my point is going to be that, I think we can dispense with like the shame narratives about mental health once we get rid of the price discrimination.
Right.
I think this like notion that like it's shame that's leading people. Everybody that I know who wants to go to a therapist isn't like ashamed to do it. It's a giant cost. I
honestly, I think that narrative has shifted dramatically. Like when I was a
Right.
kid, it was completely shameful to see a therapist. You know, it was just not, you didn't do it unless there was something really wrong with you. That message is honestly for like Biden's generation.
Exactly.
But the cost is really for just about everybody else in America. 646-257-3920. See you in the fun half.
You are in for it.
All right, folks, 646-257-3920. See you in the fun half.
Are you ready?
Who sent us this?
Alpha males are back. Boy is back. And the alpha males are back.
Just as delicious as you could imagine.
The alpha males are back. Boy is back. And the alpha males are back.
Just want to degrade the white man.
Alpha males are back.
I take all of it in my throat.
Alpha males are back.
Snowflake says what?
The alpha males are back.
You are a madman.
And the alpha males are back.
Oh no, Sam Seder! What a fucking nightmare!
Bring back DJ Danner.
Yeah, or a couple of them, just put them in rotation.
DJ Danner.
Well, the problem with those is they're like 45 seconds long, so I don't know if they're enough of a break.
That's fucking nonsense. You see white people doing drugs, they look worse than normal white people, and all white people look disgusting.
And the alpha males.
Psych. Fuck them.